Traditional dried Italian pasta is 2 ingredients, water and semolina flour. That's it. What even is semolina flour, and why do they use it for pasta? You can make pasta with all-purpose flour if you want, but there are some surprisingly good reasons why the manufacturers use semolina and why semolina evolved as the traditional choice. The name semolina describes a particular grind of flour produced from a particular kind of wheat, durum wheat. Durum is an offshoot of the emmer wheat strains from Central Europe and the Middle East. Durum remains the #1 wheat species farmed in the Middle East, probably because it likes dry conditions. Here in the US, they grow a ton of durum in the semi-arid prairies of North Dakota. And this is why Dr. Frank Manthe has a job at North Dakota State University researching and teaching about pasta, because pasta begins with durum, and they grow the durum in North Dakota.
The durum kernel is the hardest wheat.
Now, it's a little confusing because sometimes when people use the word hard to describe wheat, they're not actually describing the wheat itself, but rather products that you make from that wheat. Like, this is hard red winter wheat. And the kernels themselves are not particularly hard, they just contain a lot of protein, up to 13% protein. More protein means more gluten, which is why they use this wheat to make bread flour. More gluten proteins equals chewier texture in the resulting bread, which is why they call the wheat hard. The bread is hard, as opposed to a soft cake made from soft wheat. Durum wheat also has a protein content around 13%, like the hard wheat. But the composition of that protein is a little different, and it's not as good for making chewy, fluffy bread. So, when Dr. Manthe describes durum wheat as being the hardest wheat, he's using hard in a different sense. He's talking about the wheat kernel itself. The kernel itself is literally hard, and there's a more scientific word for that.
So there's a term called vitreousness. Okay? So when you look at a beautiful kernel of durum wheat, it looks vitreous, which means glass-like.
Here, in this paper out of Canada, they actually show the difference between kernels that appear vitreous, those are marked with a 1, versus kernels that appear starchy, those are marked with a 2. Durum tends to be vitreous because it lacks these proteins called puroindolins that attach to starch granules. And when it comes to durum, vitreousness is considered good.
It is the characteristic that causes the kernel, the endosperm during the milling, to fracture into pieces instead of being crushed into flour.
Indeed, technically semolina isn't really flour. It's a meal, like cornmeal. It feels like cornmeal in your fingers. Close up, it kind of looks like grains of sand. The kernels are hard and brittle, so they naturally shatter into these big pieces. Compare that to a pile of all-purpose flour made from common wheat. Up close, that looks like a snowbank. That is in part due to the color. Durum wheat naturally has a lot more carotenoids than common wheat has, and that gives products made with durum a nice pale yellow hue that's very pretty, especially in dried pasta when you're not going to get that color from egg. But anyway, common wheat is less vitreous, so assuming it's really dry, it just kind of smushes into that fine powder. The earliest pasta makers probably would have had trouble milling durum into a fine flour because it's so darn hard. Hence the traditional durum meal, semolina, coarse ground durum wheat flour. Why is coarse ground good for pasta?
Well, the finer you grind, the more starch damage.
Starch Damage, good name for a band. In their native state, the starch molecules amylose and amylopectin occur in these tiny little egg-looking things called starch granules. Hundreds of thousands of starch molecules all stuck together in a semi-crystalline structure that actually has growth rings. That's what those lines are, growth rings. Starch naturally occurs in those microscopic beads of thousands of individual molecules. When grains are ground really fine, you literally crack the starch granule open. That is starch damage. And while starch damage would be a great name for a metal band, it's kind of a bad name for this because damage has a negative connotation, which isn't necessarily fair. As you can see in this paper out of Ukraine, where they grew a lot of wheat until recently when their tractors were pulled off task. Anyway, some amount of starch damage is actually really important for bread baking because a cracked starch granule is much more readily broken down by enzymes into simpler sugars that yeast can eat and ferment. Damaged starch also gelatinizes more readily in hot water, and it interacts with the proteins. It can actually get you a dough that is too strong and doesn't expand as much in the oven. You get tougher, denser bread with too much starch damage. But a little starch damage is actually great for bread. This is in contrast to other fields of endeavor where we generally try to minimize damage, such as pasta making and shipping. My associates and I recently shipped out these boxes to those of you who bought my new custom chef knife, and we did so with the help of the sponsor of this video, ShipStation. Whether you got a huge business or a tiny business like mine, ShipStation is the easiest way to manage online orders for physical products that you have to ship out to people. You just take people's orders. I did it at adamragusia.com, but you can take your orders on Amazon, eBay, Etsy, whatever. ShipStation sucks all those orders into one place where you can see them, your ShipStation interface. No matter where they came from, they'll be here. Then you can easily match the orders with the best carrier to actually get it out to the customer. And you get discounts on the shipping. And you can easily send out tracking numbers from your ShipStation and deal with returns. 98% of businesses that use ShipStation for a year keep using it as long as they're still in business. That tells you something. We can use ShipStation here in the US, and it's available now in the UK, Australia, and Canada. Just go to shipstation.com/Ragusia to get a 60-day free trial. That's 2 months of free, no-hassle, stress-free shipping with my link in the description. Thank you, ShipStation. Anyway, we were discussing starch damage. Because durum wheat kernels are hard and glassy, they shatter into big shards with minimal damage to the individual starch granules. Why is that good for pasta?
An intact starch granule absorbs very little water. Okay. Now the outside gets wet. So we go back to semolina, and we're going to make some spaghetti. So we have the semolina, and we add a little bit of water. And as the water moves into that particle of semolina, it wets the outside of the starch, and it hydrates the proteins. And during that process, the proteins they kind of open up and unravel, and they expose the reactive sites, these sulfhydryl groups.
These are the sites on the individual glutenins and gliadins that bond with each other into a sticky, stretchy matrix we call gluten that holds the whole dough together. We want gluten proteins to hydrate in the pasta dough. Not so much the starches. We actually want to keep the starch dry, and an intact starch granule absorbs like half the water of a damaged starch, maybe even less. Less absorbent starch means there's more water available to hydrate the proteins. If you don't hydrate the proteins, you're not going to build that gluten matrix. Sure, you could just add more water so that there's enough water to hydrate everything and everyone, but if you're making dry pasta, you want to start with as little water as possible.
All the water you add, you have to take out during the drying process. And drying is very expensive and high energy input.
Dr. Matthew says commercial pasta dough is only about 30% water. That's a very dry dough. So if you have damaged starch granules hogging up what little water is in there, that means some of the proteins are not going to get wet and form gluten.
And that's going to affect, you're going to find little white spots in your spaghetti. Why? Because those white spots are areas that weren't hydrated. And so there is no matrix in those white spots.
You really can see this, especially in like cheap pasta. You'll see little white spots, and that's basically just dry flour that's kind of caught inside the spaghetti. And it creates a weak spot that could break during drying or shaping or cooking.
If there's no matrix or not enough matrix there, then the starch granules are exposed. They're going to absorb moisture with the heat, and they're going to gelatinize, but then they're going to burst. Then you're going to start getting leaching of the amylose out of the starch, and you're going to have high cooking loss. You can end up with very sticky spaghetti.
Basically, you're making gravy at that point. Now, you can make pasta with all-purpose flour, which has a lot of damaged starch in it, but generally people do that with fresh egg pasta. Fresh pasta doesn't ever have to be dried, so you can get things as wet as you want to, and the egg envelops all in a very secure protein matrix. You don't just have the gluten wrapping around everything, you also have the egg proteins. Very little starch is going to gelatinize and get gummy. In contrast, check out this no-egg fresh dough that I made a while ago. It's just all-purpose flour and water. This pasta boiled up pretty soft and kind of gummy and sticky. That actually worked for the particular recipe I was making, fresh orecchiette, which has more of a dumpling gnocchi-like consistency. But if you want al dente pasta, damaged starch is bad, and flour made from common wheat has a fair bit of damaged starch. So in a historical context, you gotta figure that people might have just noticed that their noodles came out better when they made them with the wheat from that field over there instead of the wheat from that field over there. The wheat in this field had randomly mutated to have harder, glassier kernels, vitreous, less starch damage during milling, better noodles. So these ancient farmers figured, hey, let's isolate this field and keep it going for noodles. Let's not mix these seeds up with the other wheat. Thousands of years of artificial selection go by, and now we have a distinct species of wheat, durum, which is perfect for pasta. Plus it's yellow. Yellow is pretty, don't you think? I think it's pretty.